I want to be clear about something before I tell you any of this. I am not a soldier. I am not a ranger, a handler, a warden, a cadet, or anything that sounds impressive when you say it out loud at a party. I am a maintenance technician, grade 7, civilian contractor, assigned to the subdeck infrastructure of Caldera Station Actual. My job for the past 11 months has been to walk corridors D9 through D14 every shift and make sure the pressure manifolds are not quietly building toward an event that would ventilate 3 decks into space. I carry a wrench. I carry a calibration tool. I carry a flask of very bad coffee because the dispenser on Subdeck 9 has been mise-coated since before I arrived and produces something that technically contains caffeine in the way that technically a lake contains hydrogen. Yes, the hydrogen is in there, but the relationship between the ingredient and the experience is doing a lot of work. I am not, in any meaningful sense of the word, remarkable. I need you to understand that part before I tell you anything else, because the version of this story where I come out looking clever is not the accurate version. I didn't plan any of it. I didn't know any of it was happening. I was doing my job, the same way I'd done my job for 11 months, and something else entirely had been doing a different and considerably more sophisticated job alongside me the whole time. The fact that those two things intersected in a way that happened to be extremely inconvenient for Velm Kaas and his enforcement team is not a reflection of my strategic acumen. It is a reflection of the fact that the Veskhari, as a species, pay close attention to things that Directorate Intelligence does not consider worth paying attention to. Things like maintenance technicians. Things like routes. Things like 11 months of shift data, corridor mapping, atmospheric signature tracking, and whatever else a colony of chitinous communal intelligence predators files internally when they have decided, quietly, collectively, without anyone asking their opinion or informing the relevant maintenance technician, that a particular human walking a particular corridor at a particular time every morning is theirs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the corridor, because the corridor is the beginning of all of it, and if you don't understand the corridor, you won't understand why any of the rest of it happened the way it did. Subdeck 9 on Caldera Station Actual is not, and I want to be precise about this, a nice place. The station proper up on the habitation and commerce decks is reasonably pleasant. There are plants in the atrium. The air recyclers up there produce something that genuinely resembles air. There are cafes, and there are things that are technically called parks, which are open spaces with benches and small decorative features. And on a station that has been in permanent orbit for 40 years, that counts as generous. The floors are even. The lighting is calibrated. Someone chose the color of the walls with the apparent goal of producing a mild positive emotional response in the beings who walked past them, and they largely succeeded. Subdeck 9 is where the station keeps everything that makes those things possible, and it is not interested in being pleasant about any of it. The corridors are bare plating, interrupted by conduit housings at irregular intervals, dark between the utility strip lights that run at floor level and serve more to tell you where the floor is than to illuminate anything in detail. The sound is constant and industrial. The low pressure hum from the manifold housings, the equalization clanks from the conduit runs when temperature differentials shift, the specific wet gurgling from junction 97 that I had filed 3 maintenance tickets about and 1 escalation, and which had simply not been addressed. Possibly because whoever reviewed maintenance tickets had decided that a gurgling junction in a corridor that nobody visited was a lower priority than whatever they were doing instead, and had maintained that assessment for 11 months. I had started to take the gurgling personally. This is not relevant to the main story, but it is true. The Veskhari liked it down there. That was the first thing I should have registered and did not, partly because I didn't know enough about Veskhari at the time to know what their preference for low-light industrial corridors might indicate, and partly because the manifolds were behind on calibration, and I had a backlog that was occupying most of my available cognition. I noticed them in my third week. Hard not to, really. A Veskhari cub is about the size of a large house cat in terms of mass, which sounds manageable until you register the 6 limbs. The chitinous shell plating that catches the strip lighting in a way that makes the animal look assembled rather than grown. The neural quills at the nape that shift and realign in patterns that suggest active processing. And the eyes. The eyes are not especially large, but they are oriented for low light. And in the utility-lit dimness of Subdeck 9, they catch what little light there is and hold it in a way that makes you very aware that you are being observed and assessed with a thoroughness that the situation does not obviously warrant. Not with hostility, with a quality more like professional interest. The interest of something that has decided you are worth the time. The first cub I saw was sitting on top of a conduit housing approximately 2 meters from where I was running a calibration on manifold 9.4. It was watching me work with the focused attention that, I later came to understand, the Veskhari bring to most things complete, unhurried, and with the air of something that is not going to be rushed by your discomfort with being watched. I looked at it. It looked at me. The quills shifted slightly, tilting in a direction I couldn't yet read. I said out loud, hello, which is what I say when I encounter anything that appears to be paying attention to me, because I was raised by people who thought it important to be polite, and the habit has survived every environment it's been tested in. The cub tilted its head. Then it looked at the manifold housing, and then back at me as if it had noted my purpose in this corridor, weighed it, and found it acceptable. I calibrated the manifold. The cub watched. When I packed up and moved to the next housing, it followed at a distance of roughly 3 meters, maintaining that gap with a precision that was either instinctual or deliberate, and that felt, in either case, considered. I assumed it was following the warmth from the conduit pipes. The housings radiate, particularly at manifold 9.4 and 9.6, where the pressure differentials run highest, and Subdeck 9 as a whole runs about 4 degrees colder than the habitation decks. A small creature that retained heat efficiently would have good reason to follow a warm-blooded mammal through a cold corridor. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. I was wrong, but it was a reasonable explanation at the time, and I filed it in the category of things noted and satisfactorily explained and moved on. By my third week, there were 4 of them, still keeping that 3-meter gap, still with the same quality of attentive, patient observation. I had started to notice individual differences. The first one was the largest and had a slight asymmetry in the left quill cluster, which I'd come to use as an identifier. A second one was smaller and moved with more lateral ranging, investigating the sides of the corridor as we walked rather than staying fixed in formation. 2 others were more conservative, holding position and watching before moving. 4 different characters, 4 consistent behaviors, the same 3-meter gap maintained by all of them with a uniformity that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. I mentioned it to Hessel, my fellow tech on the D-corridor runs, when we crossed at the junction one morning. Hessel is Bravathi, a species with a relationship to personal space that I would describe as flexible in theory and mostly absent in practice. And he told me the Veskhari had a colony in the lower maintenance decks and that they ranged up occasionally. He said the station administration knew about it. He said there had been some kind of formal accommodation worked out years ago, back when the station was first being commissioned, and that the arrangement had held without drama since. He said they didn't bother anyone. I said they didn't bother me either. He said that was good because they were the kind of thing that could, and had when the occasion had called for it, and he'd heard the stories, and he was glad the occasion wasn't calling for it now. I said I appreciated the context. He said I was welcome and went back to his manifolds. That was the sum of my formal education on the Veskhari for the next several weeks. I should have asked more questions. In my defense, The calibration backlog was real, the gurgling junction was ongoing, and four small chitinous animals following me around at a respectful distance seemed like a feature of Subdeck 9 rather than an active development requiring investigation. I flagged it in my personal notes as unusual, filed it next to the gurgling junction and the Mies-coated coffee dispenser in the mental category of things that are simply true of this corridor, and continued working. They started carrying things in my 5th week. I want to be precise about this because it sounds unlikely, and I understand why it sounds unlikely. I dropped a calibration stylus behind manifold housing 96, which sits in a narrow alcove where the conduit runs come closest to the corridor wall, and where there is approximately 14 centimeters of accessible gap between the housing and the wall. I spent 3 minutes on my knees with my arm extended as far as it would go, and did not retrieve the stylus. I stood up. I turned around. One of the cubs, not the largest one, one of the middle-sized ones, was sitting there holding the stylus in 2 of its 6 forward limbs, extending it toward me with the manner of something that is performing a straightforward and obvious task, and expects to be treated accordingly. I stood there for a moment. I performed the mental operation of registering what I was seeing and connecting it to what I understood to be true about the world, and those two things did not immediately reconcile. I said, "Thank you." The cub set the stylus on the plating between us and backed up to its 3-meter mark. I picked up the stylus. The cub watched. I went back to work. The cub went back to following at its gap. I thought about that interaction for the rest of the shift. I thought about it on the walk back to the habitation level. I thought about it for 2 more days, and then I thought about it less, because the manifolds continued to need calibration, and I am not, at my core, a person who dwells on things I can't resolve. I noted it. I found no explanation that was more compelling than the animal saw me drop something and returned it, which is a behavior some intelligent animals demonstrate, and I filed it there and moved on. What I did not think about, what I had no framework to think about, was what that interaction looked like from the perspective of a colony that processes social information collectively and catalogs it through quill broadcast to every member within range. I found out later, after everything with COS, when someone at the Xenosociology office was kind enough to forward me a consultation summary. Veskhari social cataloging does not work the way most individual actor species social processing works. They don't have a hierarchy in the conventional sense, no alpha making decisions that cascade down a pack structure. The colony is the intelligence. Every cub and adult processes sensory and social data and broadcasts it through the quill network, and every other member integrates that broadcast into their own picture. And what emerges from that distributed integration is something more like a consensus document than a decision tree. They file things. They have designations for territories, for relationships, for states of affairs, and those designations are functional. They carry weight in the colony's shared map, they drive behavior, they accumulate over time as the evidence base grows. The stylus return was not a spontaneous act of one animal. It was the action of an animal that was executing on a growing colony consensus about my status in this corridor. By week 5, based on what I understand now, the colony had been collectively assessing me for 2 weeks. The stylus moment was a test, or a threshold, or perhaps just the natural expression of a consensus that had reached sufficient confidence. This entity in our corridor returns to the same location at the same time, performs consistent maintenance work on infrastructure that the colony also uses, has not been disruptive or aggressive, and has communicated friendliness without demand. The animal closest to the dropped tool returned it. The colony noted my response. My response was to say thank you and put the stylus in my pocket and go back to calibrating manifold 96. I am told this was, in Veskhari terms, the correct response. Not effusive, not alarmed, not an attempt to escalate the interaction into something it wasn't. Just acknowledgement and continuation of work. By my 7th week, there were 9 of them on my route. The equipment bag had been modified by this point. Or rather, I had modified it, in the specific way of a person who notices that a thing keeps happening and decides to accommodate it rather than resist it. 2 of the smaller cubs had taken to riding in the main equipment compartment when I moved between sections, which presented a problem because I needed to access the equipment compartment. The solution was to always leave the large side pocket unclipped. The cubs used the side pocket. The main compartment remained accessible. I continued to tell myself I had not made structural accommodations to my work kit to facilitate the transport of predator cubs, because I am a grade 7 maintenance technician, and that is not the kind of thing a grade 7 maintenance technician does, but the evidence of the unclipped side pocket was there every morning. I also started making sure my coffee flask had a second cup's worth. Not for the cubs, who showed no interest in the coffee. They would occasionally lean toward the flask and deploy the quills in what I had come to read as their investigative posture, and then withdraw with the air of something that has gathered all the data it needs and is satisfied with the conclusion. But because sitting down for my break at Junction 99 had become an extended affair. 9 small chitinous animals settle in formation around you at 3 meters, watching you drink bad coffee, and the experience slows you down in ways you don't resist because there is something grounding about it. All that attention, sustained and non-demanding. Something about it made me drink my coffee more slowly and notice more things. I noticed, for instance, that the quill patterns varied between individuals in ways that seemed expressive. That the largest one, senior as I'd come to think of it, had a specific tilt that appeared when I was performing work it had apparently already categorized as routine, and a different tilt when I was doing something it hadn't seen before. That the smallest one, pocket, had a relationship with my equipment bag that had evolved from riding to something more like inspecting. It would sometimes remove small items, examine them with the forward limbs, and replace them with a precision that suggested it was learning the inventory. At no point did I stop and think, this colony of predators is running a sustained assessment of me and everything I carry. At no point did I think, they are building a file. I should have, but I didn't have the framework for it yet, and so it was simply, to me, a thing that was happening in my corridor, neither threatening nor particularly remarkable, just the specific texture of Subdeck 9 in the way that the gurgling junction was the texture of Subdeck 9. Hessel saw the full 9-cub arrangement once. He came around the corner at Junction 99 while I was on break, registered the scene, stopped, and stood there for a moment with the expression of a person revising their mental model of something. He said, "How long has this been happening?" I said about 7 weeks at full count, 3 weeks from the first one. He said, "And you didn't think to mention it." I said I'd mentioned it at 3 weeks, and he had told me they didn't bother anyone. He said that was before 9 of them were sitting around me, in what appeared to be a deliberate formation. I pointed out that 9 animals at 3 meters, sitting quietly and not interacting with anything, was technically consistent with his previous characterization. They were not bothering anyone. They were simply present. Hessel filed something with the administrative office. I know this because I got a message from the administrative office 3 days later, noting that my wildlife contact situation had been logged under category unusual behavior, non-threatening monitor, and that I should let them know if the situation changed in a way that affected operations. I wrote back to confirm receipt. I said the situation had not affected operations. I said the animals were not interfering with maintenance work and appeared to have no interest in doing so. I said I would continue to monitor. What I did not know was that the monitor designation, which was accurate, it was genuinely non-threatening, meant the administrative report never escalated to directorate intelligence. It sat in a wildlife contact log alongside reports of other unusual but non-threatening animal behaviors on the station, and directorate intelligence, which was busy with things it considered more pressing, did not review wildlife contact logs. The months between week 7 and Cass's arrival in my 11th month were, from my perspective, simply the texture of the work. The cubs were there every morning. The route was the route. The manifolds needed what they needed. The gurgling junction continued to gurgle. But there were changes, and I noticed them in the way you notice things when you pay attention to the same corridor every day, gradually, through accumulation, rather than through dramatic announcement. By month 8, the cubs had taken on what I can only call roles. Senior remained the constant, always at the slightly closer distance, always with that veteran steadiness I'd come to rely on as an environmental indicator. Pocket remained the investigator, its relationship with my equipment bag having evolved into something that looked, from the outside, like quality control. It would remove items, examine them, return them, occasionally in a different order than I'd packed them. 2 of the middle-sized cubs had established a pattern of moving ahead of me when I rounded corners I hadn't been around in a while, clearing the space and returning before I'd reached the turn. I noticed this first at the D12 junction, which has a blind corner where a structural brace runs close to the corridor wall. The cubs went around it before I did. When nothing concerning was there, they came back and we continued. I didn't ask them to do that. I don't know when they started. By the time I noticed it consistently enough to register as a pattern, it had already been happening for some time. In month 9, one of the conduit housings in D13 developed a stress crack in the secondary seal. This is the kind of thing that shows up on the calibration readout as a minor anomaly, something I would have caught on my next regular inspection, which was 3 days away. What happened instead was that I came around the D13 corner to find 2 of the cubs sitting directly in front of housing 13A, oriented toward it, quills tilted in what I had cataloged internally as their investigative configuration. They were not doing anything to the housing. They were simply sitting in front of it with the specific quality of presence that, by month 9, I had learned meant, this thing is different from how it was. I ran the calibration early. The stress crack was there. I logged it and escalated to full repair priority. I don't know what they sensed. The crack was subaudible. The stress on the seal was thermal, not mechanical, so there was nothing visible. Whatever they detected, their detection system was more sensitive than mine and had caught it 3 days before my schedule would have brought me to it. I filed that in my personal notes with a notation. Veskhari cubs flagged D13 housing 13.8 for stress anomaly, 3 days ahead of scheduled inspection. I didn't know what to do with the notation at the time. I kept it because I was brought up to document things accurately, even things you don't have a category for. In month 10, I started talking to them more, not because I expected a response, not in any language I'd understand, but because 11 months of a 9-being audience every morning had quietly eroded the habit of silence I'd developed working in industrial spaces. I talked to the manifolds when I was frustrated. I talked to Junction 97 whenever I walked past it and the gurgling was bad. I talked to Senior sometimes, the way you talk to a colleague who is doing something else but within earshot, a running commentary on the work, observations about the corridor, the occasional editorializing about the coffee. Senior would tilt its quills in ways that varied by context. I had developed a rough informal catalog of what different tilts seemed to accompany. The tilts that came when I said something while working, the tilts that came when I said something during the break, the tilts that came when the work went unexpectedly and I was frustrated about it. The catalog was rough and I wasn't confident in it, but it was there, assembled from 10 months of paying attention. By month 11, the corridor felt, and I am using this word with full awareness of how it sounds, inhabited in a way it hadn't in month one. Not crowded, not different in its industrial fundamentals, but inhabited the way a space is inhabited when the things that live in it have decided that you're part of the inventory of the place and have arranged themselves accordingly. I did not know the word for that arrangement in Veskhari colonial terms. I found out in month 11 on a Tuesday, when Veskhari came around the corner at Junction 99 with his data slate and his enforcement team, and his extremely thorough file on Dara Salis. He did not have a line about 9 Veskhari cubs and a growing adult escort presence in Subdeck 9. He did not have anything about the colony's wildlife contact log entry, or about month 9's D13 anomaly flag, or about Pocket's ongoing quality control relationship with my equipment bag, or about the 2 cubs who swept corners ahead of me. He had excellent data on everything he had been looking for, and no data on anything he hadn't thought to look for. This is, in my experience, a common condition, and it is not a criticism. You cannot surveil things you don't know exist. The gap in his file was the shape of what the Veskhari are, not a failure of his methodology as applied to the things his methodology was designed to find. The distinction mattered. It was also, eventually, the thing he went home thinking about. Kos came around the corner at Junction 99 on a Tuesday in my 11th month with 3 enforcement officers in Directorate Gray. And here is what he saw when he turned the corner. A grade 7 maintenance technician sitting on a conduit housing eating a protein bar, and 9 chitinous predator cubs arranged in a deliberate radius around her at 3 meters, all of them immediately oriented toward the new arrivals, and the largest one already deployed in a configuration he had no entry for in any briefing document he'd been given before the operation. He arrived on a Tuesday. D11 through D14 are my Tuesday run, which puts me at Junction 99 for my break approximately 4 hours into the shift. That's where I was when Kos and his team came around the corner. There were 4 of them. Kos, who was Skeithrin, a species that runs scaled and angular, with a quality of watchful precision in the face that reads, across species lines, as someone who is always calculating something, and 3 enforcement officers in Directorate Gray with the blue service trim that on Caldera Station functions as "take me seriously" visual shorthand. I was sitting on a conduit housing with a protein bar and the bad coffee. The 9 cubs were arranged around me at 3 meters, sitting very still in the formation they adopted when they were giving maximum attention to something new. Senior had its quills fully deployed and fanned. I had never seen that configuration before, and I registered it as a deviation from Senior's baseline without yet understanding what it signified. The other 8 were in their positions, not vocalizing, not moving, simply orienting toward the 4 new arrivals with the full weight of their collective attention. Kos looked at me, he looked at the cubs, he looked at me again. He said, Dara Salis, maintenance technician, grade 7, 11 months on Caldera Station, originally contracted through Helix Infrastructure Group, now on a direct station contract. Assigned to the Subdeck 9 through 14 corridor infrastructure. I said yes, that was accurate. He introduced himself, Directorate Intelligence, which I had gathered from the jacket, and he had that quality of directness about it that said he was used to names opening doors. He said there were some irregularities in my access logging on the infrastructure management network, and that he needed to discuss my access history with me. I said I was happy to discuss my access history. I said I had filed tickets for all non-standard access. I said the gurgling junction at 97 had required me to open a panel that technically sat under an adjacent corridor's authorization, and that I had submitted a cross-authorization request and 3 follow-up reminders over a period of 4 months, none of which had been processed, and that the junction had continued gurgling for 11 months as a result, and that he was welcome to review the ticket trail, which was time-stamped. He said there were other irregularities. He had a data slate. He held it with the manner of someone who has put significant work into what's on it and expects the act of displaying it to communicate authority. He began describing the irregularities. I want to pause here to tell you what the Cubs were doing, because it becomes relevant, and I was not paying close enough attention to it in the moment, because Koss was describing access irregularities that I needed to be thinking about. Senior had moved. I noticed this in my peripheral vision. Senior does not move without reason, and the deviation from the 3-meter holding position was a deviation from 11 months of established behavior that registered even at the edge of my attention. Senior had moved 2 meters closer to the corridor entrance, which was where Koss and his team were standing, and the quills were deployed in the full fan configuration. The orientation was not curious. It was the attentiveness of something that has designated a variable as requiring monitoring. The other 8 had all shifted. They were still at 3 meters from me, which placed them at roughly 1 meter from Koss's enforcement officers, depending on who had moved and in which direction. They were not aggressive. They were not vocalizing. They were present in the way the Veskhari were present when they had concluded that a situation required full attention, the quality of stillness that isn't relaxed but is so controlled it looks like relaxation from a distance. One of the enforcement officers put his hand on the tool at his belt. Not drawing it, a precautionary touch, the hand's way of knowing where resources were located. Senior looked at that officer with a focus that I can only describe as complete. The officer's hand moved away from the belt. Koss was still describing access irregularities. He had a good deal of material. He had clearly put work into the file. He was describing it with the methodical thoroughness of a professional who has prepared carefully and expects that preparation to drive the conversation in a specific direction. I said, "Could you give me a moment?" He paused. I looked at Senior. I said clearly and without drama, "It's fine. They're just here to talk." I don't know if that did anything causal. I have been asked about this many times since, and I keep giving the same honest answer. I don't know. I know the tone of voice I used. I know the Veskhari had been listening to me talk for 11 months to myself, to Hessel when we crossed, to the manifold housings when I was frustrated with them, to the Cubs at Junction 99 every morning. I know my tone in that moment was the same tone I used when I said hello to the first Cub in week 3. Even, unhurried, informational. I have no way to know whether the Veskhari processed that as meaningful input or whether what happened next was coincidence. What I know is that after I said it, Senior sat back down. The quills stayed deployed. The closing distance held at 2 meters rather than the original 3, but Senior sat. The other 8 Cubs resettled. Koss watched this happen. He lowered the data slate slightly. He said very carefully, "What are those?" I said they were Veskhari. I said they had a colony in the lower maintenance decks and ranged up to subdeck 9 regularly. I said they had been doing it for as long as I'd been on station. He looked at them, he looked at me. He said, "And they follow you." I said that was one way to describe it. He said, "For how long?" I said about 11 months, all 9 of them for the last 4 months or so. The first one started showing up in week 3. The pause that followed had a specific texture to it. It was the pause of someone running a search in a well-organized mental catalog and not finding the entry they expected to find. The largest Veskhari adult chose this moment to come out of the D11 access run. I had seen adults occasionally in the months before that day, 3 times at a distance, always moving with purpose along the conduit runs, not engaging with me directly, simply present in the maintenance decks as a background fact. Adult Veskhari are built for what they are with an efficiency that requires no display to communicate. 6 limbs that move with the economy of things that have never needed to hurry because uncertainty is not a condition they spend much time in. Chitin plating that sits flush and articulated against the body, Not armor added to a frame, but armor that is the frame's surface expression. The neural quill cluster in an adult is substantially larger than in a cub, broader bandwidth. The xenosociology report would later tell me, meaning more processing, more simultaneous integration, more range in the broadcast. This one was large even by adult standards. It came out of the access run at its unhurried pace and moved to a position 4 meters past the junction, between Koss's team and the corridor that led deeper into the subdeck. It did not lower its body or deploy its quills in any of the threat configurations I had seen in nature documentaries. It simply moved to a position and occupied it with the completeness of something that has considered every aspect of a situation and arrived at a single, simple conclusion about where to be. One of the enforcement officers said something short in a language I didn't speak. The tone was immediately clear. Koss said something to the officer that I didn't catch, but that had the cadence of a firm instruction. The officer held position. Koss looked at the adult. He looked at me. He looked at 9 cubs at their measured radius, and at Senior 2 meters out with the quills still up, and at the adult 4 meters behind him between his team and the exit. He said, "How many of them are there?" I said I honestly didn't know. I said I mostly interacted with the ones on Subdeck 9, and I didn't have a full census. He said, "And they consider you." He stopped. He seemed to be working out how to phrase something precisely. He tried again. "What exactly is the relationship between you and this colony?" I thought about that. I thought about 11 months. I thought about the stylus behind housing 96 and the unclipped side pocket and the bad coffee at junction 99 every morning, with 9 attentive small observers. I thought about the way Senior had moved 2 meters toward his team before I had registered that there might be something worth moving toward. I said, "I'm the maintenance technician for this corridor." Koss looked at me steadily. He said, "That's not what I mean." I said I understood what he meant, but that was the accurate answer. That was what I was. I walked the corridor. I calibrated the manifolds. I'd been doing it for 11 months. Whatever the Veskhari made of that, they had arrived at it themselves, without my direction and largely without my awareness. I hadn't asked them to follow me. I hadn't known they were developing a formal position on the matter. I was just the person who showed up every morning and did the same work in the same sequence. Koss was quiet. It was a different quality of quiet than his earlier pauses, less calculation, more absorption. One of the enforcement officers had taken a small, involuntary step backward, not away from me, away from Senior, who had rotated to maintain orientation toward the officer's movement without otherwise changing position. The rotation was minimal. It communicated, without any display and without any sound, that every movement in the corridor was being noted and indexed. The officer stopped moving. Senior oriented back toward Koss. I said, "Is there a specific access irregularity you need resolved today? Because I can pull the ticket trail right now. The 97 cross authorization is the most obvious gap, but I have documentation going back 11 months on all of it." Koss looked at his data slate. He looked at the adult Veskhari. He looked at the 9 cubs. He looked at me. He said, "I'm going to need to make some inquiries before we continue this conversation." I said that was fine. I said I'd be on my route tomorrow morning as usual, same corridor, same time. He said he understood. He signaled to his team. They began moving back toward the corridor entrance, carefully, in the way of people who are acutely aware of where every significant variable in a room is located, and who are attempting to move without advertising that awareness, which is a difficult balance to maintain, and which they did not entirely achieve. The largest enforcement officer, who had put his hand on his belt, moved with particular deliberateness, his movements measured in the specific way of someone who has decided that the variables in this corridor respond to behavior, and that his behavior should therefore be legible. The smallest cub Pocket was sitting directly in Kos's path, at approximately knee height to him, not blocking him. Just sitting there, quills tilted at a considering angle, watching his feet with the interest of something making a detailed study. Kos stopped. Pocket looked at Kos. There was a pause, the specific pause of two different kinds of intelligence registering each other. Pocket moved 18 centimeters to the left. Kos stepped through. I heard one of the enforcement officers say something very quietly to another, a question about protocol for situations involving colonial intelligence pack predators, and the other say, equally quietly, that they would find out. Then they were around the corner. Subdeck 9 settled back into its baseline hum. The gurgling junction was still gurgling. The manifolds were still running. The strip lights were doing their best. I sat there for a moment with my coffee. I looked at Senior. Senior's quills were still deployed, but the fanning had reduced. The adult in the access run had not moved. Pocket had returned to my equipment bag and was looking at the unclipped side pocket with pointed interest. I said out loud, "Well, that was a morning." I unclipped the pocket. I finished my coffee. I put the flask back in the equipment bag. I stood up, detached the D11 manifold keys from my belt, and went to finish my run, because D11 through D14 were not going to calibrate themselves, and I had already lost 40 minutes to the conversation with Kos, and whatever was happening at 97 was not going to improve without me. The cubs came with me. 9 of them at 3 meters, the same radius they'd held for months, the same focused attentiveness they brought to everything. Senior took up a position slightly closer than usual, at roughly 2.5 meters, and held that distance for the rest of the shift. The adult came out of the access run and followed behind. I noted all of this. I did not know what to do with it exactly, so I filed it in the same mental category I used for everything else that happened in Subdeck 9, labeled it accurately unusual, non-threatening, requiring further information, and calibrated manifold D11. Kos came back 4 days later. 4 days is roughly how long it takes for Directorate Intelligence to run a full colonial species consultation, which is what you have to do when your field operation encounters a situation that falls under the multi-species accommodation agreements, and you need to know exactly what those agreements say. The agreements on Caldera Station were old commissioned era and had not been widely reviewed in recent years, because the situation they governed had been stable, and stable situations do not generally attract reviews. Kos's field operation was, by most measures, the first review those agreements had gotten in some time. He came back alone. No enforcement team. Just Kos in his directorate jacket, walking around the corner at Junction 99 at the same point in my shift where I'd been on break 4 days earlier, as if he had noted the time and was being precise about it. He stood at a distance he'd clearly chosen with care and said good morning. I said good morning. He said the cross-authorization tickets had been reviewed and that the 9/7 access issue had been resolved in my favor. The access was documented appropriately. The follow-up failures were an administrative matter on the station's end, and his assessment was that my access log irregularities had a legitimate explanation in every case. I said I was glad to hear it. He said the concerns regarding my activity on Caldera Station were being closed without further action. I said I appreciated that. He stood there in the quality of a man who has more to say and is working out whether he has the right words for it. A man who is very good at a specific kind of precision and has recently encountered a situation that his precision was not calibrated for, and is trying to be as precise about that as he is about everything else. He said the colonial consultation, the Veskhari colonial map. I said I'd been forwarded a summary. He said the designation has been active since your 3rd week on station. I said I'd gathered that from the summary. He said slowly, Root claimed. He said it carefully, with the attention of someone handling something that has turned out to be heavier than it looked. That's 11 months ago. We had no record of it. I said I didn't either, for most of that time. He said, you weren't aware. I said I was aware of the cubs following me and of the stylus return and of them riding in my bag. I said I had thought it was about the warmth from the conduit pipes. I said I had been wrong about that. He nodded. He said we had 11 months of surveillance on this corridor. Access logs, entity passage records, network timestamps, atmospheric sensors, every registered interaction. He paused. He said we had nothing on the colonial map, nothing on the designation. Nothing on the designation's implications under the accommodation agreements, which, as it turns out, are considerably more specific than anyone in my office had reason to review until this week. He paused again. 11 months. I said his surveillance was probably excellent for the things it was designed to monitor. He said yes. He said that was precisely the problem he was going to be thinking about. I said I didn't know a great deal about Veskhari social cataloging, but from the consultation summary, they process and communicate through Quill broadcast rather than through any individual action or network interaction. No single Veskhari had filed an access log. No single Veskhari had made a recorded communication in any medium his sensors were calibrated to detect. The designation existed in the Quill network, distributed and reintegrated across every member of the colony, accumulating for 11 months, and there was no centralized data point where it sat in a form that looked like a record. He said he understood that. He said his office was going to be updating its methodology on colonial intelligence species. I said that seemed reasonable. He said week 5, the stylus behind housing 96. He had read the consultation summary carefully. That was the threshold event. That was when the designation was broadcast. I said I had gathered that, yes. He said before that they were assessing, building the evidence base. After the stylus exchange, the consensus was sufficient and they filed the designation. I said it had seemed like a large amount of infrastructure for a dropped stylus. He said the Veskhari were, in his professional assessment, very thorough. I said in my experience, yes. He looked at Senior, who was sitting at the standard 3-meter distance and watching our conversation with the complete attentiveness the Veskhari brought to things they had decided mattered. He said, your route tomorrow morning. I said it would be the same as always. He nodded. He said good morning again. He left. I looked at Senior. Senior's quills tilted. Pocket was already investigating the equipment bag. I sat there in Subdeck 9 for another few minutes. I thought about what 11 months of showing up every morning and calibrating manifolds had apparently amounted to, in a set of terms that I had not known existed until 4 days ago. I thought about the Directorate's cameras and the Veskhari's quills, and the gap between what each of them was designed to find, and about what had been sitting in that gap for 11 months while both parties did their work. The Directorate had watched me for 11 months and concluded I was a data point requiring investigation. The Veskhari had watched me for 11 months and concluded I was worth protecting. Both conclusions were based on the same 11 months of the same behavior. The behavior was, I showed up. I did the work. I said hello to things that looked at me. I said thank you when something was returned. I shared the corridor without demanding it. I kept the same rhythm every morning, the same route, the same sequence, without drama and without interruption. I am told, by people who know the Veskhari better than I do, that what those things look like in Veskhari terms is something close to what the word trustworthy points toward, in the same way that a magnetic compass points toward something it doesn't contain. Not the word itself. The thing the word is reaching for. The sustained behavioral evidence of being the kind of presence that a corridor can hold without cost. They had watched for 11 months and built a picture from that, and the picture was worth filing under a designation that carries the full weight of colonial protection protocol. Koss had watched for 11 months and built a picture from different data, and the picture had been wrong in a way that was, from his professional standpoint, going to require some significant methodology review. The roots, it turned out, were better data than the cameras. I drank the rest of my coffee. I picked up my keys. I walked D11 through D14 with 9 small chitinous professionals at 3 meters and the large adult moving at a distance behind, and I calibrated the manifolds, and I noted the pressure indicator at D13 that had been reading high and scheduled it for follow-up, and I logged D14 as satisfactory, which it was, for once. I filed my maintenance record. I included a footnote about the directorate visit and its resolution, because I log things that happen in my corridor, and that was a thing that had happened. I received a message from the administrative office 3 days later. The gurgling junction at 97 had been repaired, finally, at priority level. The repair log had a notation, flagged for immediate resolution per colonial accommodation protocol. Route maintenance is anchor support infrastructure. I read that twice. I thought about Koss reading the accommodation agreements. I thought about whoever processed maintenance tickets reading the accommodation agreements. I thought about 11 months of a gurgling junction that nobody had fixed, and then I thought about how long it had taken after the directorate's consultation for the junction to be listed as priority. I filed that in the same mental category I used for everything that had happened in Subdeck 9 this month, which was noted, processed, no further action available to me. The corridor continues. I have been back every morning since. The route is the same. The manifolds need what they need. The coffee is still bad, though I have filed another ticket on the dispenser, and this time, for reasons I choose not to examine too closely, it was processed in 4 days. The cubs are all 9 of them still there. Same radius, same attentiveness, same quality of professional interest in the work. Pocket still investigates the equipment bag. Senior still holds the slightly tighter 2.5 meter distance it adopted the afternoon of Koss's visit. The large adult comes up from the lower deck sometimes, not every day, but regularly, and when it comes it positions itself in the access run for the duration of my shift and leaves when I leave. I don't know if the escort level changed after what happened, or if it was always there, and I simply wasn't paying attention in the right direction to see it. I suspect the latter. I suspect a great many things were happening in Subdeck 9 that I wasn't paying attention to in the right direction, and that the Veskhari were paying very close attention to all of them, and that the picture that emerged from 11 months of that attention was cleaner and more accurate than anything that came from the cameras. There was one more thing I found out, in the week after Koss's second visit, that I think belongs in this account because it is relevant to the full picture. One of the enforcement officers from Koss's first visit filed a separate report, apparently, not through directorate channels, but through the station's own safety observation system, which is a parallel reporting structure that maintenance workers are also authorized to use, and that I had personally used 7 times regarding Junction 97. The report cited the behavioral response of non-cataloged colonial predator assets to enforcement activities and recommended that future directorate operations in subdeck infrastructure be preceded by a colonial intelligence consultation. The report was accepted. A copy was forwarded to the administrative office, which forwarded it to me as a matter of courtesy, noting that my name appeared in it as the anchor presence cited in the operational description. I read the report. The enforcement officer who wrote it had used precise, careful language. He described the adult's position in the access run as a tactical placement consistent with protection pattern behavior in pack-bonded colonial species. He described Senior's positional shift as a proactive response to perceived anchor threat that preceded any observable trigger from the anchor presence herself. He described the overall situation as operationally unresolvable through standard enforcement posture, without unacceptable risk of triggering a protection response from the full colony's adult contingent. That last phrase is the one I've been thinking about since. The full colony's adult contingent, not 9 cubs and 1 large adult. Whatever Cass's team had walked into at Junction 99 that Tuesday morning, the enforcement officer had understood immediately, in the moment, in a way that Cass was still working through on his second visit, that what was visible in that corridor was not the totality of what was present. The 9 cubs at 3 meters and the adult in the access run were the part of the colony's response that I could see. The rest of it was a fact of the corridor that nobody had needed to make explicit, because the enforcement officer had already run the calculation. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the months when I'd noticed adults in the lower maintenance decks, 3 sightings over 11 months, always at distance, always deliberate. I thought about how I'd categorize those as incidental, routine, background. I thought about the 2 cubs who cleared corners ahead of me without my instruction, and the one who'd flagged housing 13-8 3 days before I would have reached it in my schedule. I thought about the fact that the Veskhari had been running a distributed intelligence operation in Subdeck 9 for the entire 11 months I'd been working there, and I had understood approximately 15% of it. Hessel asked me, a few weeks after all of it, at the junction at the start of a shared shift, what I thought the Veskhari had been getting out of the arrangement, what the exchange was from their side. Why a colony of colonial intelligence predators would spend 11 months building a file on a maintenance technician and then file a protection designation. I said I thought the corridor had been theirs first, and that I had started walking it and had not disrupted anything and had done consistent, useful work in it, and that over time that had become a working arrangement, and that working arrangements, when they are sustained and consistent and honest, are apparently the thing the Veskhari recognize as worth formalizing. I also said that I thought the D13 housing anomaly had something to do with it. That I thought the Veskhari, who were operating on infrastructure that they used as much as I did, their migration routes ran through those conduit systems, their nesting spaces were in those lower decks, had something invested in whether the manifolds were calibrated and the conduit seals were intact. Not in a way they could act on themselves, but in a way they could note and assess and observe whether the entity walking the route was addressing. 11 months of watching me address it, every shift, the same careful sequence, nothing skipped. They had a corridor, I maintained it. The maintenance meant something to them beyond what I'd known. Hessel was quiet for a moment after I said that. He said that sounded like a very understated way of describing a working partnership with a pack of colonial predators. I said I was a maintenance technician. Understated was my professional register. He said fair enough. He also said that Directorate Intelligence had issued an internal methodology review notice, not widely announced, but he'd heard about it through the administrative office, and that the notice referenced colonial intelligence species and surveillance gap protocols, and that he thought I should know. I said I appreciated it. He said he thought the Veskhari had known about the Directorate surveillance long before I did. I said I thought they probably had, yes. He said, and they filed the designation anyway, knowing Cass was watching. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said they weren't hiding. I said no. They weren't hiding. They were doing what they did in a corridor they had claimed, the same way they'd been doing it before I arrived, and the same way they would do it after I was gone. The Directorate's cameras were a fact of the environment the same way the conduit housings and the utility strip lights and the gurgling junction were facts of the environment. The Veskhari had noted them and incorporated them into their picture and continued their work, because there was nothing in their picture that required concealment. They were a colony with a claimed root and an anchor presence and a designation on file. They had been doing what colonial entities with claimed roots and anchor presences and designations on file do. Kos watching did not change any of those facts. That, I thought, was the part he was going to be thinking about for a long time, not the gap in his data, the reason for the gap. He had cameras and sensors and access logs and network monitors, and all of those tools were calibrated to find individual actors doing individual actions in documented interactions. The Veskhari were not individual actors doing documented interactions. They were a colony conducting distributed assessment of an anchor presence in a claimed route, and the assessment had been running continuously for 11 months in a medium that his sensors were not designed to detect, in a data format his analysts had no entry for, producing a conclusion that his field operation had encountered on a Tuesday morning and had not been able to resolve through standard enforcement posture. The conclusion was me, sitting on a conduit housing with bad coffee. It is, I think, a very human thing to imagine that the important events in a given period are the ones that generate records, access logs, network timestamps, interaction reports, the things that leave a mark in a system that another system can read. I am a maintenance technician and I believe in records. I have filed 7 tickets on Junction 97, and I have the timestamps to show for all of them. Records matter. But the Veskhari have been a colonial intelligence species for longer than Caldera Station has existed, and in that time they have developed a way of building a picture of a situation that does not require the situation to cooperate by generating entries in anyone's log. They watch, they integrate, they broadcast. They build a consensus, slowly, over months, from the accumulated weight of consistent small things, and the picture that emerges from that process is not stored anywhere that a surveillance system knows to look. It exists in the Quill network. It lives in 11 months of collective observation. It arrives at a designation, and the designation carries weight. The weight, when Kos tested it, turned out to be substantial. I have been back every morning since. The route is the same. The manifolds need what they need. The coffee is still bad, though I've filed another ticket on the dispenser and it has, for reasons I choose not to examine too closely, been resolved at priority level. Junction 97 no longer gurgles. The cubs are all 9 of them there, same radius, same attentiveness. Pocket still investigates the equipment bag. Senior holds the slightly tighter distance it adopted that afternoon. The large adult comes up regularly, and when it does it accompanies the shift, and when the shift ends it returns to the lower decks. The D13 housing seal I caught early holds fine. The manifolds in D11 through D14 are running within spec. The corridor is what it is, bare plating and strip lights and industrial hum, and the specific inhabited quality of a space that 2 very different kinds of intelligence have decided is worth paying attention to. I am the anchor presence on route claimed. I was a maintenance technician first. I think, on reflection, the Veskhari understood those 2 things to be the same thing from a very early stage, and that it took me 11 months and a visit from Directorate Intelligence to catch up to their assessment. They had better cameras, we had better data. The data was the route. The route was always ours, and now there's a designation on file to confirm it.